The question we get asked probably most often is the question from low-hour pilots. They've got a few hundred hours and they're asking us, what can I do to get a job as a pilot? How am I going to move my career forward? I think that there's no one single thing. I think actually there's a few different things that low-hour pilots need to do to try and help themselves to move forward. I think first of all, they still need to remain selective about the jobs that they apply for. It's no good taking a scattergun approach to the jobs they apply for and applying for everything, even if they don't meet the criteria. They should remain selective about what they apply for. They still need to have a great CV, and perhaps even more so because there's a lot of competition for low-hour jobs. They need to stand out in a really good way. So having a good CV is really important to a low-hour pilot in getting their first position. They need to go the extra mile, so they've got to make sure that they produce a tailored, bespoke application for each of the jobs that they apply for. They shouldn't have a generic application letter. It's no good having a generic CV, perhaps. They need to make sure they tailor their approach to the specific position they're applying for. And going through the application process, they need to go the extra mile. They need to do more research than other pilots. They need to ask better questions. They need to be better prepared for interview. They need to stand out in lots and lots of good ways because there's so much competition for that space. So one of the things I talked about in my presentation today was I talked about the importance of candidates asking really good interviews in the actual interview itself. So of course, people go to interview expecting to be asked questions. And yes, you will be asked questions at interview. But in reality, the client, the airline, the recruiters are going to expect you to ask them questions. If a candidate goes to interview and fails to ask any questions, or their questions are really poor, or maybe they only have a couple of questions, I don't think that represents the candidate very well. In my experience, airlines expect to be asked some good questions during the interview process. So, what sort of questions should a candidate ask at interview? Well, I talk about two groups of questions. One are what I talk about is kind of HR questions, and the second is about credibility building questions. So first of all, HR questions. The interview really is not the place to be asking basic HR questions. You really don't want to be asking about how many days holiday will I get and what will my healthcare benefits be and what will the hours be. It's not the place to be asking those questions. If you're working with a recruiter or even if you're applying direct to an airline, really you should have been able to ascertain that information prior to the interview. The interview is all about selling yourself. And so you need to ask some really good credibility building questions. Credibility building questions are questions that demonstrate that A, you've done your research on the organisation and the opportunity, and B, you know your stuff, okay? So what sort of questions might you ask in an interview? Well, if you wanted to demonstrate that you had done your research and you know your stuff, you might, for example, and to make up a question, you might make reference to a particular aircraft type that the airline is flying. You may say, well, I see that you fly this particular type of aircraft. And then you might make reference to some specific detail about that aircraft that demonstrates your knowledge and experience. You might make reference to the range of that aircraft. You might make reference to some technical challenge associated with the flying the aircraft. The point here is you're demonstrating your knowledge and your experience, and you're building your own credibility as a candidate, and you're building your credibility by demonstrating research and knowledge and understanding.